What does it feel like to inhabit a city that has never fallen, not once, not in 1100 years, not to any army that has ever stood beneath its walls? Generations were born inside Constantinople, lived their whole lives inside it, and died inside it, without ever once seeing an enemy banner planted on its ramparts. To be born there was to inherit a kind of certainty that most empires never get to feel, the certainty that your home was, quite literally, unconquerable. That certainty is the reason this story is so often told wrong. Most tellings rush straight to a single morning in the spring of 1453, a cannon, a breach, an emperor vanishing into the smoke, as though the city's fall were a single event that arrived out of nowhere, a lightning strike against an otherwise unshaken tower. It makes for a dramatic story. It is not an accurate one. If you are settling in for this one, you might dim the light near you, let your shoulders drop, and get comfortable, because this is a long story, and it deserves the time. And if you find that these long, slow walks through history are something you genuinely look forward to, there is a subscribe button somewhere near this video, and it does help this channel keep making them. Though that is entirely your choice, not a request that needs answering right now. The truth is that Constantinople's fall took closer to 1,000 years than a single day. It began not with Ottoman cannon fire, but with slow administrative decay, with borders that shrink a little more with each passing generation, with a Christian army, not a Muslim one, that broke the city open 2.5 centuries before the Ottomans ever arrived at its gates. By the time Sultan Mehmed II stood outside those famous walls in the spring of 1453, he was not conquering an empire. He was administering the final rites to one that had, in every meaningful sense, already been dying for 200 years. This is the story of how that happened. Not just the 53 days of siege that everyone remembers, though we will walk through every one of them. Not just the young sultan's obsession with a city he had dreamed of since childhood, though that obsession shaped everything that followed. This is the story of an empire that called itself Roman for 11 centuries after Rome itself had crumbled, of walls so formidable they reshaped the logic of medieval warfare, of a gun so large it had to be built on site because no road could carry it, and of a last emperor who chose, in the end, to disappear into his own city rather than survive its fall. It is also the story of what was lost when Constantinople finally did fall, and, more surprisingly, what was gained, scattered outward into a Europe that was not yet ready to admit how much it needed what fled from that city's libraries and universities. There will be time, across the hours ahead, for the chain that was stretched across a harbor, for ships hauled bodily over a hillside in the dark, for a gun so large it had to be borne from the earth beside the road it would eventually travel. There will be time for the scholars who carried an older world's learning westward before anyone quite understood what they were preserving. None of it needs to be rushed. You have the whole night for this, if you want it. Before any of that, though, you need to understand what this city actually was. Not a fortress. Not a battlefield. A city built, from its very foundation, to be something the ancient world had never quite managed before, an eternal capital. To understand how something eternal finally ends, you first have to understand how it began. In the year 324, the Roman Empire had a problem that gold and legions could not solve. Rome itself, the city that had given the empire its name, sat too far west to defend an empire that increasingly needed to watch its eastern borders, where Persian power pressed against Roman territory, and its northern frontiers, where the pressure of migrating peoples never fully eased. The emperor who inherited this problem was a man named Constantine, and rather than accept a slow strategic disadvantage, he decided to build an entirely new capital from nothing, in exactly the right place. He chose a small, ancient Greek trading town called Byzantium, founded some 1,000 years earlier by settlers from the city of Megara. It sat on a peninsula at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, where the narrow strait now called the Bosphorus connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and from there to the Mediterranean. On 3 sides, water. On the 4th, a narrow neck of land that could be walled and defended with a fraction of the manpower a landlocked capital would require. It was, by any military logic of the age, close to the perfect defensive position. Constantine did not do this modestly. He renamed the city after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and poured the resources of an empire into making it worthy of the name. He commissioned a forum, a hippodrome for chariot racing that could seat tens of thousands, churches, palaces, and a great column topped with his own statue, deliberately built in the style of the old pagan sun god, repurposed for a Christian empire that was still, in the 320s, working out exactly what a Christian empire was supposed to look like. He called it New Rome. That name mattered more than it might seem. The people who would go on to live in this city for the next 11 centuries never called themselves Byzantines. That word was invented by Western scholars centuries after the city's fall, as a way of distinguishing a Greek-speaking, Constantinople-based state from the Latin-speaking Rome of the history books. The people who actually lived there called themselves Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor. Their laws were an evolving continuation of Roman law. When the city they were building around them eventually took its final shape, it did so as the direct, unbroken continuation of the empire that Augustus had founded 4 centuries earlier. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes everything that follows. When this city finally falls in 1453, it does not mark the end of some separate, lesser successor state. It marks the actual, final end of the Roman Empire, the empire of Julius Caesar and Augustus, still calling itself Roman, still governed from a throne its citizens considered a direct continuation of ancient Rome, right up until its final morning. Western Rome, the city on the Tiber, would fall to Germanic peoples in 476, less than 150 years after Constantine dedicated his new capital. Historians mark that year as the end of the Western Roman Empire, and in the popular imagination, as the end of Rome itself. But in Constantinople, nobody noticed a change in status. The empire simply continued, as it always had, from its eastern capital. Rome's fall in the West was, to the people living in Constantinople, someone else's catastrophe. For centuries after that, the city grew into something almost unmatched anywhere on the planet. At its height, in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, its population may have exceeded 400,000 people, a scale that most European cities would not approach again for the better part of 1,000 years. Justinian rebuilt the Hagia Sophia after riots burned the earlier church to the ground, and the new cathedral, with its enormous dome seeming to float on light pouring through a ring of windows at its base, became one of the wonders of the medieval world. Foreign visitors, Slavic envoys, Western pilgrims, Arab traders, arrived expecting a large city and left describing something closer to a vision of heaven translated into stone. The city Justinian ruled over was not simply large. It was engineered to sustain that largeness indefinitely. Beneath the streets and public squares, enormous underground cisterns, vast forests of stone columns holding up brick ceilings, filled with water carried in by aqueduct from hills many kilometers distant, meant the city could survive a siege lasting months without ever running dry, a defensive advantage that mattered as much as any wall. Above ground, the Hippodrome, seating perhaps as many as 100,000 spectators, hosted chariot races between rival factions, the Blues and the Greens, whose rivalry was not simply sport but something closer to organized political identity, capable of tipping into riot with startling speed. In 532, exactly this happened. A chariot racing dispute exploded into what became known as the Nika riots, which very nearly toppled Justinian's throne entirely and burned much of the city center, including the earlier Hagia Sophia, to the ground, the very fire that gave Justinian his opportunity to rebuild the cathedral into the wonder it became. Trade flowed through the city on a scale that matched its population. Silk, carried overland for thousands of kilometers along routes that eventually reached China, arrived in Constantinople's markets alongside spices from India, furs from the Rus lands to the north, and grain from Egypt, and the city's central position meant that goods moving between virtually any 2 points in the medieval world, Europe and Asia, the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, tended to pass through, or at least near, its harbors. This commercial centrality generated tax revenue on a scale that let successive emperors fund armies, buy off enemies, and construct monuments no other medieval capital could match. This was the city's peak. It would never again be quite this large, quite this wealthy, or quite this secure. What came next, across the centuries that followed, was not a single dramatic collapse, but something slower and in some ways harder to notice while it was happening, a long, uneven retreat. Empires rarely die of a single wound. More often, they bleed slowly, from many small cuts, over a span of time too long for any one generation to fully register as decline. This was the pattern that defined the centuries between Justinian's golden age and the crisis that would eventually deliver Constantinople to the Ottomans. The first great cut came from the south and east, in the 7th century, when a newly unified Arab world, carried forward by the rapid spread of Islam, tore through territories the empire had held for 600 years. Syria fell. Egypt fell, with it, the grain that had fed Constantinople's enormous population for centuries. North Africa fell. Within a single generation, the empire lost roughly 2/3 of the territory it had held at Justinian's death. What remained was smaller, poorer, and permanently on a defensive footing that it would never fully shake off again. For a time, the empire adapted brilliantly. It reorganized its remaining territory into military provinces called themes, each responsible for raising and supplying its own defensive army, a system that let a smaller state punch well above its shrunken weight for centuries. Constantinople itself withstood 2 determined Arab sieges, in the 670s and again in 717 and 718, both times saved partly by its famous walls and partly by a closely guarded incendiary weapon that came to be called Greek fire, a substance that could burn on top of water, sprayed from tubes mounted on ships, whose exact formula was considered so valuable to state security that it was never written down in any surviving record, and remains, even now, not fully reconstructed. Those 2 sieges are worth remembering, because they set the pattern that would define Constantinople's reputation for the next 700 years. Enemies came. The walls held. The enemies eventually left, exhausted, having gained nothing. By the 9th and 10th centuries, this reputation had calcified into something close to a religious conviction among the people who lived there. The city was under the personal protection of God and the Virgin Mary, its walls an extension of divine favor rather than mere engineering. That belief would matter enormously centuries later in ways that were not entirely helpful. The empire's next great cut came in 1071 at a battle fought far from Constantinople itself, near a town called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. There, a Roman army under Emperor Romanos IV was decisively defeated by Seljuk Turkish forces under Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle itself was not catastrophic in casualties by the standards of the age, but its aftermath was internal political chaos in Constantinople. Following the emperor's capture and eventual removal from power, left Anatolia, the empire's most populous and productive remaining heartland, undefended at exactly the moment Turkish forces began pouring into it. Within a decade, most of Anatolia, the deep well of soldiers, farmers, and tax revenue that had sustained the empire for centuries, was gone. This loss mattered more than any single battle before or after it. Constantinople could survive losing Egypt, losing Syria, even losing the Balkans piece by piece, all of which it eventually did, in one form or another, over the following centuries. But Anatolia had been the empire's core. Without it, the state that remained was, structurally, no longer capable of fielding the kind of army that had once made it a superpower stretching from Spain to Persia. From this point forward, an empire that had once dictated terms to its neighbors increasingly had to negotiate, bribe, marry into alliances, and play rival powers against one another simply to survive. It is a hard thing to watch, this kind of decline, when you know how it ends. Each individual emperor in this period, and there were many, some capable, some not, ruling in a system where the throne changed hands through inheritance, coup, blinding, or occasionally all three within a single decade, inherited a smaller, weaker version of the empire than his predecessor, and in most cases handed on something smaller and weaker still. Some pushed back the tide for a reign or two. The decline was never simply linear. In the 10th century, well before Manzikert, an emperor remembered as Basil II spent decades in grinding campaigns against the Bulgarian Empire to the north, eventually crushing it so thoroughly, after a battle in 1014 whose exact details later chroniclers embellished considerably, that the empire's northern frontier was secured for generations. And Basil died having left behind a treasury so full that his less disciplined successors spent much of the following half-century simply working through it. Manuel Comnenus, in the 12th century, briefly restored something resembling imperial confidence, campaigning as far as Egypt and northern Syria and marrying into the great royal houses of the West. But the underlying arithmetic, a shrinking tax base, a shrinking recruiting ground, and increasingly powerful neighbors on every side, never truly reversed. Even the empire's remaining strength, in these centuries, increasingly depended on outsiders. Norman adventurers from southern Italy, Venetian and Genoese merchant fleets granted trading privileges in exchange for naval support, and mercenary companies recruited from as far as Scandinavia and the British Isles, including the famous Varangian Guard, the emperor's own elite bodyguard, drawn for generations largely from Norse and later English warriors, increasingly filled roles that a native Byzantine army, shrunk by the loss of Anatolia's manpower, could no longer fill on its own. This dependence bought time. It did not buy a lasting solution, and in the case of the Italian merchant republics especially, it planted a commercial and political entanglement that would have consequences neither side fully anticipated. It was, in fact, an appeal for outside help that first drew large Western armies into direct, sustained contact with Constantinople in the first place, and that contact set patterns that would echo, in far less fortunate form, a century later. In 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, seeking mercenary reinforcements to help stabilize the empire's eastern frontier after the losses following Manzikert, sent envoys to Pope Urban II asking for military assistance. What came back, in response, was not the modest force of hired soldiers Alexios had requested, but an enormous, largely uncontrollable mass of Western knights, nobles, and armed pilgrims, the beginning of what became known as the First Crusade, a movement whose scale and independent religious motivation caught Byzantine diplomacy entirely off guard. Alexios managed, through careful and often exhausting negotiation, to extract oaths of loyalty from the crusading leaders and to redirect much of that army's energy toward reclaiming former Byzantine territory in Anatolia before it continued on toward Jerusalem. It worked, after a fashion, and it bought the empire real strategic breathing room. But it also established, in the minds of many Western crusaders and their descendants, an image of Byzantium as a wealthy, overly cautious power more interested in managing crusaders for its own advantage than in fully committing to their cause, a resentment that would not be forgotten by the time a very different crusading army arrived at Constantinople's gates a little more than a century later. And then, in 1204, the empire suffered a wound unlike any that had come before it. Not from a foreign, non-Christian power at all. From an army that shared its faith, wore the same cross, and had, in theory, come to help. Understanding what happened in 1204 requires understanding what a crusade actually was, at least on paper. By the start of the 13th century, Western Christendom had already launched several armed pilgrimages toward the Holy Land, driven by a mixture of genuine religious devotion, the search for land and plunder among younger sons who would inherit nothing at home, and complicated politics between popes, kings, and the merchant republics of Italy that controlled the ships everyone needed to actually get anywhere. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was meant to sail to Egypt, then considered the most strategically vulnerable approach to recapturing Jerusalem. It did not go as planned. The crusading army, having contracted with the Venetian Republic for a fleet far larger than the number of soldiers who actually showed up to fill it, found itself deeply in debt to Venice before a single ship had left port. Venice, whose aging but shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo had every intention of being repaid, offered the Crusaders a way to work off part of that debt, help Venice recapture a rebellious Adriatic port city on the way. It was an uncomfortable start, Christian soldiers attacking a Christian city in order to satisfy a commercial debt, and it set a troubling precedent for what followed. A deposed Byzantine prince, traveling with the Crusader army, then offered the Crusaders an even larger prize, help him seize the Byzantine throne from his uncle, and he would pay off the entire crusading debt, supply troops for the journey to Jerusalem, and bring the Eastern Church into union with Rome. For an army already deep in debt and increasingly detached from its original religious purpose, the offer was, in the end, difficult to refuse. What followed was a fully armed crusading fleet diverting not toward Egypt and not toward Jerusalem, but toward Constantinople itself. The city's formidable land walls had turned back armies for 8 centuries, but the Crusaders, arriving primarily by sea, attacked from the direction of the Golden Horn, where the sea walls were comparatively less imposing and less well garrisoned. After a complicated series of sieges, betrayals, and a fire that devastated large sections of the city, Constantinople, a city whose people had spent generations believing it stood under the direct protection of heaven, was taken by force in April of 1204 for the first time in its entire history. What happened over the following days is, even by the standards of medieval warfare, remembered as unusually brutal, and it is worth being careful here, because accounts from this period come almost entirely from writers with strong reasons to shape the story one way or another. Byzantine chroniclers, understandably, emphasized the horror of it. Western accounts, particularly those written to justify the crusade afterward, tended to minimize it. What can be said with reasonable confidence, drawing from multiple surviving sources, is that the city was subjected to several days of organized and disorganized looting, that churches and monasteries, including the Hagia Sophia itself, were stripped of relics, gold fittings, and treasures accumulated over 8 centuries, and that a meaningful portion of that plundered wealth ended up not destroyed, but shipped west, much of it to Venice, where visitors today can still see bronze horses. Taken from Constantinople's hippodrome standing above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica. The human cost of those days is harder to state with precision than the material cost, and this account will not attempt to manufacture a false certainty where the sources genuinely disagree. What is not in dispute is the scale of the political and psychological wound. The Crusaders did not simply loot the city and leave. They stayed, carving up the Byzantine Empire's territory into a patchwork of Western feudal states, a so-called Latin Empire centered on Constantinople itself, alongside smaller Crusader principalities scattered across Greece and the Aegean. Byzantine resistance regrouped in exile, primarily in the city of Nicaea across the strait, where a rump government continued to call itself the legitimate Roman Empire and spent the next 57 years working to take its own capital back. Before the sack itself, the Crusades' leaders and their Venetian partners had already drawn up a formal treaty dividing the Byzantine Empire's territory among themselves in advance. In anticipation of the victory they were confident was coming, a document that allotted specific provinces, islands, and revenue streams to Venice and to the various Frankish nobles involved, with a fixed formula for dividing whatever plunder the conquest produced. This advanced planning says something important about how the campaign's leadership had come to regard the enterprise well before a single wall was breached. Not as a defensive intervention on behalf of a fellow Christian power in crisis, but as a conquest to be carved up like any other, its spoils allocated by treaty before the fighting had even properly begun. The Latin Empire that ruled Constantinople for those 57 years never achieved the stability its founders had hoped for. Its Western rulers struggled to govern a Greek-speaking population that regarded them, with some justification, as occupiers rather than legitimate sovereigns, and the new Latin state found itself squeezed on every side by rival successor states, the Byzantine government in exile at Nicaea, another Byzantine splinter state centered on Trebizond along the Black Sea coast, and a third in Epirus in northwestern Greece, each claiming, in one form or another, to represent the true continuation of Roman authority. Venice, meanwhile, extracted enormous commercial privileges from the arrangement, securing control over key ports and trade routes throughout the fractured Byzantine world, a foothold that would shape Mediterranean trade politics for the next 2 centuries. They succeeded, in 1261, when a Byzantine general named Michael Palaiologos, who would go on to found the dynasty that included Constantine XI among its final members, recaptured Constantinople in what was, by the standards of the original conquest, a relatively bloodless operation. A small force slipping through an unguarded section of wall while the city's Latin garrison was away on campaign. The Roman Empire, reduced now to a fraction of even its already diminished pre-1204 territory, moved back into its ancient capital and resumed calling itself, without apparent irony, the Eternal Empire of the Romans. But something had changed that could not be recaptured along with the city. The library and archive holdings that had accumulated over 8 centuries, many of them irreplaceable, had been scattered or burned. The wealth that had once let emperors buy allies, hire mercenary armies, and outlast crises through sheer financial depth was gone, mostly permanently. And the psychological certainty that had defined the city for 800 years, the conviction that Constantinople simply could not fall, was gone as well. It had fallen once already, and to fellow Christians, no less. The empire that reoccupied the city after 1261 was, in every practical sense, a shadow of what it had been on the eve of 1204, reduced in territory, reduced in wealth, and permanently more vulnerable to whatever came next. What came next, gathering strength for roughly a century and a half in the hills of northwestern Anatolia, was a small emerging Turkish principality that would eventually take the name of its founder, a chieftain called Osman. His descendants would come to be known, across Europe and the Middle East alike, as the Ottomans. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman state that had grown out of Osman's small Anatolian principality had become something far larger and more organized than a mere frontier warband. It controlled most of Anatolia and a substantial swath of the Balkans, having crossed into Europe more than a century earlier and steadily absorbed territory that had once belonged to Byzantium, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Constantinople, by this point, was less a capital city ruling an empire than an isolated, fortified enclave. Its remaining territory shrunk to little more than the city itself and a scattering of nearby lands, surrounded almost entirely by Ottoman-controlled ground. Earlier Ottoman rulers had already made attempts on the city. Sultan Bayezid I laid a long siege in the 1390s, lifted only when a Mongol Turkic conqueror named Timur invaded Ottoman territory from the east and forced Bayezid to abandon the siege to deal with a far more immediate threat. Sultan Murad II, father of the man who would finally take the city, besieged it again in 1422, and again failed, this time called away by a rebellion elsewhere in his own territory. Constantinople, it seemed, kept surviving less through its own strength than through the simple good fortune of its enemies being distracted at the critical moment. That fortune ran out with the accession of Murad's son. Mehmed II came to the Ottoman throne for the second time. He had briefly held it as a boy years earlier, before his father reclaimed power in 1451 at around 19 years old. His first, brief reign as a boy sultan in the early 1440s had not gone smoothly. Still a child, thrust onto the throne while his father temporarily withdrew from politics, Mehmed found his authority openly tested by his own ministers and by a serious military crisis on the empire's European frontier, a humiliating enough experience, by most accounts, that his father was recalled to resume the throne directly, leaving the young Mehmed to spend several more years as a provincial governor before. His father's death finally returned the crown to him for good. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe him as intensely intelligent, fluent, or at least conversant in several languages, deeply interested in engineering, classical history, and the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and consumed, from a young age, by a fixation on the one prize that had eluded every Ottoman ruler before him, Constantinople itself. His second accession, in 1451, was accompanied by an act that later Western chroniclers seized upon as evidence of a uniquely ruthless character, though it reflected an established, if brutal, Ottoman succession practice rather than a personal invention of Mehmed's own. An infant half-brother, potential rival claimant to the throne, was killed on Mehmed's order within days of his taking power, a practice later formalized in Ottoman law under Mehmed's own reign as a means of preventing the succession disputes and civil wars that had repeatedly weakened the empire in earlier generations. It is not an episode this account will dwell on further, except to note that it set an early tone, a willingness, from the very start of his reign, to make hard, sometimes brutal calculations in service of a stable, consolidated throne. Some later chroniclers, writing after his eventual success, portrayed this obsession as almost destined, the natural culmination of a young genius's singular purpose. It is worth treating that framing with some caution. It is exactly the kind of narrative that gets written backward from a known outcome, smoothing away the genuine uncertainty that existed at the time. What can be said more confidently, from the accounts of advisors and officials who dealt with him directly, is that Mehmed pursued the conquest of Constantinople with an intensity that alarmed even some of his own senior ministers, several of whom initially urged caution, preferring to consolidate Ottoman gains in the Balkans and Anatolia rather than risk a difficult and expensive siege against a city that had, after all, defeated every previous attempt against it. Mehmed did not share that caution. He moved quickly and deliberately in the 2 years before the siege began. In 1452, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress, Rumeli-Hizari, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across the strait from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, the two fortresses gave the Ottomans complete control over the narrow waterway, able to halt or destroy any ship attempting to pass without permission, cutting Constantinople off from potential grain shipments and reinforcements arriving from the Black Sea, and giving the new fortress its blunt, still remembered nickname among Byzantines at the time, the Throat Cutter. He also began assembling something the Ottoman military had never fielded on this scale before, a siege train built specifically to break walls that had never been broken by force in 11 centuries. This meant recruiting engineers, gathering enormous quantities of gunpowder and shot, and, in a decision that would prove decisive, acquiring the services of a foreign gun founder whose skills the Byzantines themselves had failed to properly value. Beyond the artillery and the fortress, Mehmed also rebuilt and expanded the Ottoman navy in the months before the siege, aware that any serious attempt on Constantinople would need to contest the surrounding waters as well as the land approach, given how much of the city's defensive strength had always depended on its access to the sea. Shipyards along the Bosphorus and elsewhere in Ottoman territory worked through the winter of 1452 into 1453 constructing and refitting galleys, and by the spring, Mehmed commanded a fleet substantial enough to blockade the city's sea approaches even if it could not yet match the individual size or construction quality of the Venetian and Genoese vessels it would eventually face. Mehmed also worked to neutralize potential threats to his rear before committing to the siege. He renewed or extended treaties with Venice and Hungary, two powers capable of intervening on Byzantium's behalf, buying enough diplomatic space to focus his full attention on the city itself. By the start of 1453, virtually everything was in place, the fortress controlling the strait, the beginnings of an unprecedented siege artillery train, A diplomatic situation that isolated Constantinople from likely rescue, and a young sultan whose personal will appears, from the surviving record, to have driven the entire enterprise forward against real internal skepticism. What he did not yet have was a workable plan for breaking through walls that had defeated every army that had ever stood before them, including armies far larger than the one he could realistically field. That problem, and its solution, is where this story turns next, to the walls themselves, and to the man whose engineering finally gave Mehmed a way through them. To understand why Constantinople had never fallen to a direct assault in over 1,000 years, you have to understand what, exactly, an attacking army was facing when it reached the city's landward side. The Theodosian walls, named for the 5th century emperor under whom they were built, were not a single wall in the way most people picture medieval fortifications. They were a layered system, roughly 6 kilometers long, stretching the full width of the peninsula from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, and they had been designed by engineers who understood, with unusual sophistication for their era, exactly how siege warfare actually worked. An attacker approaching the walls first had to cross a wide moat, roughly 20 meters across in places, which could be flooded with water diverted from nearby streams. Beyond the moat stood a low outer wall, several meters high, defended by its own parapet and a series of towers. Beyond that outer wall lay a terrace, a killing ground, essentially, where any force that breached the outer wall would find itself exposed, with no cover, directly beneath the far larger inner wall looming above. And that inner wall was the real barrier, roughly 12 meters high in places, up to 5 meters thick at its base, reinforced by 96 towers spaced at intervals close enough that defenders on any one tower could support the towers on either side of it with missile fire. This design meant that an attacking force did not face one wall to break through. It faced 3 successive obstacles, each one covered by defenders positioned above and often to the sides, and a system explicitly engineered to make a direct infantry assault extraordinarily costly, no matter how large the attacking army. For over 1,000 years, this system worked essentially as designed. Avars, Arabs twice over, Bulgars, Rus raiders, and countless smaller forces had thrown themselves against these walls, and every single one of them had eventually been forced to withdraw, having gained nothing but casualties. The wall's reputation grew, over the centuries, into something approaching legend, both within the city and beyond it. Byzantine writers described them in near-religious terms as a divine gift protecting God's chosen city. Foreign visitors from Western Europe, arriving from cities whose own fortifications were, by comparison, modest, wrote home in genuine astonishment at the scale and sophistication of what they were seeing. By the 15th century, the walls had come to function almost as a psychological weapon in their own right, a physical embodiment of the belief, held by Byzantines and often by their enemies too, that Constantinople simply could not be taken by force. The walls were pierced by a number of great gates, each with its own name and history, several of which carried ceremonial as well as military significance. The Golden Gate, at the wall's southern end near the Sea of Marmara, had originally been built as a freestanding triumphal arch, later incorporated into the wall system, and was traditionally reserved for the ceremonial entry of emperors returning from successful military campaigns, a use that, by the empire's final century, had become an increasingly rare and increasingly bittersweet ceremony, as fewer and fewer campaigns ended in anything resembling triumph. There is a particular kind of danger in a defense that has worked perfectly for 1100 years, though, and it is not the danger of the walls themselves weakening. By the 15th century they had, if anything, been repaired and reinforced many times over the centuries, including major restoration work following earthquake damage in the 1440s. The danger was subtler. An entire strategic culture had grown up around the assumption that these walls made frontal siege warfare essentially unwinnable for any attacker. That assumption had been, for over a millennium, entirely correct. Set beside the fortifications of contemporary Western Europe, the scale of the difference becomes clearer still. Most European castles and city walls of this era, however formidable in their own regional context, were built to resist far smaller forces than those that regularly gathered against Constantinople, and few, if any, matched the triple-layered depth of the Theodosian system or its sheer continuous length across an entire peninsula. This was not incidental. Constantinople had spent 11 centuries as one of the single most valuable and most contested prizes in the entire medieval world, and its defenses had been built, tested, and rebuilt accordingly, in a way that fortifications designed mainly to deter regional rivals or raiding parties elsewhere in Europe simply never needed to be. It was about to stop being correct, not because the walls themselves had gotten weaker, but because siege technology, for the first time in the wall's long history, was about to fundamentally change in a way their 5th century designers could never have anticipated. Stone walls 12 meters thick had been built to resist trebuchets, battering rams, siege towers, and sappers digging beneath the foundations, every tool that a medieval besieging army had available. They had not been built to resist cannon fire, because when they were designed, gunpowder artillery did not yet exist anywhere in the world. By 1453, it did. And the man who would bring the largest gun ever cast up to that point directly to the foot of these walls was, in one of history's sharper ironies, a man who had first tried to sell his services to Constantinople itself. His name, according to the surviving sources, was Orban, a Hungarian, or possibly German, founder of cannon, whose exact background remains genuinely unclear in the historical record, with different chroniclers giving different and sometimes contradictory details about his origin. What is more consistently reported is what he did in the year or two before the siege began. Orban arrived in Constantinople sometime around 1452, offering his services as a gun founder to Emperor Constantine XI. Byzantine finances, by this point in the empire's history, were in a state that can fairly be called desperate. Tax revenue had shrunk along with the empire's territory, and the treasury struggled to pay even for basic garrison maintenance, let alone an ambitious new artillery program. Constantine reportedly found Orban's proposed wages too high to meet, and after some negotiation that ultimately went nowhere, Orban left the city and offered his services instead to Sultan Mehmed. Mehmed, unlike Constantine, had access to the deep resources of a rapidly expanding empire, and he gave Orban essentially everything he asked for: generous pay, ample raw material, and the freedom to build whatever he believed possible. What Orban proposed was audacious even by the ambitious standards Mehmed himself was setting. He would cast a bronze cannon larger than any that had been built before, a gun so massive that, according to several surviving accounts, it required as many as 60 oxen and hundreds of men working together simply to move it, and had to be cast on site near the Ottoman capital because no existing road network could have transported a finished gun of that size across the terrain. The finished cannon, sometimes called the Basilica in Ottoman-era sources, was reportedly capable of firing stone balls that may have weighed several hundred kilograms over distances of well over a kilometer. It was not the only large gun in Mehmed's siege train. He had commissioned an entire battery of cannon of varying sizes, but it became, in both contemporary accounts and the historical memory that followed, the symbol of the entire siege, a single weapon whose sheer scale seemed to announce that an old kind of warfare had just ended. Moving the finished gun from its foundry to the walls of Constantinople was, on its own, a considerable feat of medieval logistics. According to several accounts, the journey required weeks of dedicated effort by dozens of teams of oxen and hundreds of laborers, moving at a pace that some sources describe as only a few kilometers per day, with roads and bridges reinforced or specially prepared along the route to bear the gun's enormous weight. This was not a single weapon quietly wheeled into place. It was a public spectacle in its own right, one that would have been visible and audible in its slow, grinding progress to every village and town along its path, carrying its own psychological message about the scale of what Mehmed was bringing to bear long before it ever fired a single shot at the walls themselves. It is worth being honest about the gun's actual battlefield performance, because the legend has, over the centuries, occasionally outpaced the reality. By most technical accounts that survive, the great cannon was slow and cumbersome to operate. Some sources suggest it could be fired only a handful of times per day, requiring extensive time to cool and reload between shots, and its barrel reportedly showed signs of strain and possibly cracking under repeated use as the siege wore on. It was not, on its own, a weapon that could simply blast open a city in an afternoon. But its real significance lay less in any single shot and more in what it represented alongside the rest of Mehmed's artillery train, a sustained, weeks-long bombardment capable of doing something no siege engine in Constantinople's previous 11 centuries had ever managed, genuinely damaging the ancient Theodosian walls themselves, section by section, day after day, in a way that stone-throwing trebuchets and battering rams never could. The wall's defenders would find themselves, for the first time in their long history, facing a nightly race against their own attackers, patching, with earth, timber, and rubble, whatever the day's bombardment had cracked open, only to see the same sections targeted again the following morning. This was the fundamental shift that made 1453 different from every siege that had come before it. Not simply a larger army, though Mehmed's forces did substantially outnumber the city's available defenders. Not simply greater determination, though that mattered too. It was a genuine technological turning point, the arrival of gunpowder artillery powerful enough to challenge fortifications that had been engineered brilliantly for a world in which such weapons did not yet exist. Constantine XI, inheriting a throne with too little money to keep the man who built that weapon in his own service, would spend the coming siege discovering exactly what that turning point meant for a city and an empire that had staked its entire survival on walls built for an earlier age of war. Constantine XI Palaiologos came to the Byzantine throne in 1449, inheriting a title that had once meant ruler of the known civilized world and now meant, in practical terms, the mayor of a single fortified city and a scattering of nearby territories. He was in his mid-40s by the time the siege began, an experienced soldier and administrator who had spent years governing the Byzantine territories in the southern Peloponnese before being called to Constantinople to take the imperial crown, following the death of his brother, John VIII, who had died without a son of his own. By most surviving accounts, Constantine was a capable and personally courageous ruler, well regarded by those who served under him, though the sources describing him come overwhelmingly from writers sympathetic to his cause, and a fully independent account of his personal character simply does not exist. What is clear from the administrative record is the scale of the problem he inherited: an empire reduced to Constantinople itself, a handful of nearby towns, and some scattered holdings in Greece under the rule of his brothers, surrounded on every landward side by Ottoman territory, with a treasury too depleted to maintain more than a skeleton garrison and a population that some estimates place as low as 40 or 50,000 people, rattling around inside walls that had once enclosed a city of several 100,000. Constantine's path to the throne itself reflected the empire's diminished, fractured state. Rather than being crowned in Constantinople in the traditional manner, he was proclaimed emperor in 1449 at Mistras, the Byzantine stronghold in the southern Peloponnese, where he had spent years as a capable regional governor alongside his brothers Thomas and Demetrios, who continued to rule the Peloponnese jointly after Constantine's departure for the capital, a division of what little remained of the empire that would itself cause friction between the brothers in the years ahead. He arrived in Constantinople to take up his throne without a wife at his side. Two earlier engagements, arranged for political advantage, had ended with the deaths of his intended brides before either marriage could take place, and a third attempt to arrange a marriage, this time to a Georgian princess, was still in negotiation when the siege began, and never came to fruition. He would die, then, as he had ruled, without an heir, the line of succession that had defined the Palaiologos dynasty for nearly 2 centuries ending with him in more ways than one. Constantine understood, likely better than almost anyone else in his position could have, exactly how precarious his situation was. In the years before the siege, he pursued what avenues he could to secure outside help. He renewed the long-contested question of church union with Rome, the idea that the Eastern Orthodox Church would formally accept the authority of the Pope in Rome, in exchange for Western military support against the Ottoman threat. A formal declaration of union was proclaimed in the Hagia Sophia itself in December of 1452, only months before the siege began. It did not deliver what he needed. The union was deeply unpopular among much of Constantinople's population and clergy, many of whom viewed doctrinal submission to Rome as a betrayal of Orthodox tradition, and some contemporary accounts suggest that certain officials openly declared they would rather see the city under the Sultan's turban than under a cardinal's hat, a phrase that may be somewhat exaggerated or reshaped in the retelling, as such vivid quotations from this period often are, but which captures a genuine and significant strain of local resistance to the Union regardless of its precise wording. And even where the Union was accepted, it produced only modest, delayed Western military support, a contingent of a few hundred professional soldiers from Genoa and elsewhere, led by a capable condottiere named Giovanni Justiniani Longo, rather than anything resembling the large crusading army that might have genuinely altered the siege's outcome. When the Ottoman forces arrived outside the walls in early April of 1453, Constantine's available defenders numbered, by most modern scholarly estimates, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men. A mixture of Byzantine soldiers, Genoese and Venetian volunteers and mercenaries, and armed civilians, attempting to hold a wall system stretching some 20 kilometers around the city's full perimeter, against an Ottoman force that most estimates place somewhere between 50 and 80,000 fighting men, though contemporary chronicles on both sides sometimes inflate these numbers considerably for dramatic effect, and modern historians treat the most extreme figures with appropriate skepticism. The arithmetic was, by any reasonable measure, close to impossible. Constantine knew this. Several accounts suggest that in the days before the siege began in earnest, he was offered terms by Mehmed, the chance to leave the city peacefully or to remain as a tributary ruler under Ottoman authority, keeping his life in some measure of local rule in exchange for surrendering the capital without further bloodshed. According to the surviving accounts, Constantine refused, reportedly telling Mehmed's envoys that he alone had no right to hand over a city that belonged to all its people, to Christendom, and to God, and that he would rather die there than live having surrendered it. Whether those exact words were spoken, in that exact form, is impossible to confirm with certainty. This is precisely the kind of noble last stand quotation that later chroniclers, sympathetic to the fallen emperor, had every incentive to embellish or invent outright. But the underlying fact those words represent is not in serious dispute. Constantine did not surrender, did not flee, and remained inside the city through every day of the siege that followed, preparing to defend walls that both he and, by many accounts, his own advisors increasingly suspected could not ultimately hold. He was not, in the end, entirely without allies, however thin those alliances proved to be. And before the guns began their work in earnest, there was a wider world beyond the walls that might, in theory, have come to his aid. Understanding why it largely did not is essential to understanding how this siege was actually won and lost. Western Europe in 1453 was not blind to the Ottoman threat gathering against Constantinople. Popes had preached crusade against Ottoman expansion for decades. Reports from Byzantine ambassadors, merchant communities, and travelers had circulated through European courts describing, in increasingly urgent terms, the shrinking Byzantine state and the growing Ottoman one. And yet, when the siege actually began, the military response from the rest of Christian Europe amounted, in practical terms, to remarkably little. The reasons for this were not simple indifference, though indifference certainly played some part. Western Europe in the 1450s was a fractured political landscape, consumed by its own conflicts. France and England were only just concluding the 100 Years' War, a struggle that had drained both kingdoms for over a century. The Holy Roman Empire remained a loose confederation of competing princes rather than a unified state capable of rapid, coordinated military action. Hungary, the Christian kingdom most directly exposed to Ottoman expansion in the Balkans and therefore theoretically most motivated to act, had suffered a series of costly defeats against Ottoman forces in preceding years and was in no position to mount a major new campaign on short notice. There was also, running beneath the political fragmentation, a genuine and long-standing religious estrangement between the Latin Christian West and the Greek Orthodox East, a divide dating back centuries, hardened considerably by the events of 1204, when a crusading army had, after all, sacked Constantinople rather than defended it. That history had not been forgotten on either side. Some Western clergy and rulers viewed the Byzantines' continued resistance to full doctrinal submission to Rome as a genuine obstacle to full-throated support, despite the December 1452 Union Proclamation, which many in the West suspected, not without reason, given how deeply unpopular it proved inside Constantinople itself, of being a purely political maneuver rather than a sincere religious commitment. Venice and Genoa, the two Italian maritime republics with the deepest commercial interests in Constantinople and the Black Sea trade routes beyond it, did send some support, though it arrived piecemeal and, in Venice's case, considerably delayed by internal political debate over how large a commitment the Republic could actually afford. Genoa's contribution came primarily through private initiative rather than official state policy. Justinian's contingent of several hundred professional soldiers arrived as what amounted to a well-organized mercenary force rather than a fleet dispatched by the Genoese government itself, though Genoese officials in the nearby colony of Galata, just across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, maintained a complicated position throughout the siege, offering the city informal support while officially attempting to preserve neutrality with the Ottomans, on whose goodwill their own trading colonies' survival ultimately depended. Hungary, in particular, deserves a slightly closer look because its absence from the siege was not simply a matter of indifference. The Hungarian commander János Hunyadi had, only a few years earlier, led major campaigns against Ottoman forces in the Balkans, including a serious defeat at Varna in 1444 that had cost the lives of a substantial portion of Hungary's fighting nobility and, remarkably, the young Polish-Hungarian king the Ladislaw himself, whose body was never conclusively identified after the battle. That defeat, still fresh in Hungarian memory, made the kingdom's leadership deeply cautious about committing to another major eastern campaign so soon afterward. Further south and west, in Albania, a resistance leader remembered by the honorific Skanderbeg continued to tie down meaningful Ottoman military resources with a stubborn guerrilla campaign throughout this period. A genuine drain on Mehmed's available forces, though not one significant enough, in the end, to meaningfully delay his plans against Constantinople itself. Pope Nicholas V did send some material support and made efforts to organize broader relief, and there were smaller contingents and individual volunteers who made their way to the city from various parts of Catholic Europe, moved by genuine religious conviction or simple adventure. None of this amounted to anything close to the kind of large-scale, coordinated crusading response that had, in earlier centuries, occasionally been mustered against threats to Christian territory in the eastern Mediterranean. The age of large crusading armies, in practical terms, had already largely passed by 1453, worn down by centuries of costly and often unsuccessful campaigns, shifting political priorities, and the simple fact that Western Europe's major powers were, by this point, increasingly preoccupied with consolidating and governing their own territories rather than launching expeditions to the east. Further west still, the Kingdom of Aragon and Naples, ruled at this time by Alfonso V, maintained its own ambitions in the central Mediterranean and its own complicated relationship with the papacy. And while Alfonso occasionally expressed interest in leading a broader crusading effort against Ottoman expansion, those ambitions never translated into meaningful, timely action either, caught up as they were in his kingdom's own regional rivalries and the general difficulty of coordinating any large multinational effort across the fractured political landscape of 15th century Christendom. Taken together, the pattern across the whole of Western Europe was strikingly consistent: genuine awareness of the danger, genuine expressions of concern and sympathy, and, when it came to the sustained, coordinated, well-funded military response the situation actually required, remarkably little that arrived in time to matter. There is no need to overstate the West's culpability here, nor to understate it. Constantinople's isolation in 1453 was the product of decades, arguably centuries, of accumulating strategic, religious, and political drift between the Latin West and the Greek East. Not a single act of betrayal at the final hour, however much later writers, understandably moved by the tragedy of the city's fall, sometimes framed it that way. What can be said plainly is this: when Mehmed's army arrived outside the walls in April 1453, Constantine XI was defending his city with a force built almost entirely from what the city itself, plus a handful of foreign volunteers acting largely on private initiative, could muster, not with the support of a unified Christian world that many both inside and outside the city might once have expected to arrive. With that isolation established, the siege itself could begin in earnest. And its opening moves would center not on the great land walls first, but on a different kind of barrier entirely, one built not from stone, but from iron, stretched across the mouth of the city's harbor. The Golden Horn is a long, narrow inlet running along the northern side of Constantinople's peninsula, and for the city's entire history, it had functioned as one of the finest natural harbors anywhere on the Mediterranean or Black Sea coasts, deep enough for large ships, sheltered from rough weather, and easily defended, provided its narrow mouth could be closed to hostile vessels. By 1453, the Byzantines had a proven method for doing exactly that, a massive iron chain, its links forged thick and heavy, that could be stretched across the harbor entrance, floated on wooden pontoons, physically blocking any ship from entering without either breaking the chain or finding another way around it. This chain mattered enormously to Constantinople's defensive strategy for reasons that went beyond simply protecting merchant shipping inside the harbor. The city's sea walls, running along both the Golden Horn side and the Sea of Marmara side, were generally less massive and less heavily garrisoned than the great Theodosian land walls, in part because the strong currents and, on the Horn side, the presence of the chain itself had historically made a serious naval assault from those directions far less attractive to besieging forces than a direct approach along the landward walls. If Ottoman ships could be kept out of the Golden Horn entirely, the defenders would only need to seriously worry about one major front rather than two or three. The chain itself was not a new invention improvised for this particular siege. Constantinople had used similar harbor closing chains during earlier crises, including, by some accounts, during the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, and the technique reflected a broader Byzantine tradition of naval defense that relied as much on controlling access to the city's waters as on the land walls themselves. The version deployed in 1453 was reportedly among the largest and heaviest ever used for the purpose, its individual links substantial enough that moving and positioning the chain required a dedicated and carefully coordinated effort each time it needed adjustment. When Mehmed's forces arrived and the siege formally began in early April 1453, the Byzantine defenders, working with their Genoese and Venetian allies, secured the great chain across the harbor mouth exactly as their predecessors had done in previous centuries, and stationed a small allied fleet inside the Horn to help defend it, under the overall command of a Venetian captain named Alviso Dido, whose ships, though few in number compared to the Ottoman fleet gathering outside, were generally larger and more heavily built than their Ottoman counterparts, giving the defenders a real, if limited, qualitative advantage in any direct naval engagement. In the siege's early days, this defense largely held. An Ottoman naval attempt to force the chain directly failed, and in one notable early engagement in April, a small squadron of Genoese and Byzantine ships managed to fight its way through the Ottoman blockade in the Sea of Marmara to reinforce the city, a rare and celebrated success for the defenders in an otherwise steadily worsening situation. Mehmed, watching this naval frustration play out and unwilling to accept a stalemate on a front he considered strategically vital, arrived at a solution that would become, alongside the Great Cannon, one of the most remembered episodes of the entire siege, a plan audacious enough that some later writers questioned whether it happened quite as dramatically as it was later described, though the core of the achievement is well attested across multiple independent sources from both the Ottoman and Byzantine sides. If his ships could not force their way through the chain by water, he would simply take them around it, overland. The plan, as it came together in the last weeks of April 1453, was this: rather than continue attempting to break the Great Chain by direct naval assault, Mehmed would move a portion of his fleet out of the Bosphorus, overland, across the hilly terrain north of Galata, and relaunch the ships directly into the Golden Horn on the far side of the chain, bypassing the barrier entirely and placing an Ottoman naval presence inside the harbor the defenders had believed was sealed. The logistics of this were formidable. Ottoman engineers reportedly constructed a greased wooden track, using cut logs laid as rollers, running from the Bosphorus shore up over the ridge and down into the Golden Horn on the far side, a distance most estimates place at somewhere around 1 to 2 kilometers over ground that was neither flat nor easy. Ships were then hauled overland along this track using teams of oxen and large numbers of men pulling in coordination, their masts still stepped and sails reportedly hoisted in some accounts, either for genuine sailing assistance on any downhill sections or, as other historians have suggested, partly for the sheer psychological theater of the moment. The operation took place, according to most accounts, over a single night, or possibly across 2 nights of concentrated effort, with the first Ottoman ships appearing inside the Golden Horn on the morning of April the 22nd, to what most sources describe as genuine shock among the city's defenders, who had organized their harbor defenses around the assumption that the chain made a naval presence inside the Horn essentially impossible. Some modern historians have raised reasonable questions about certain details in the most dramatic retellings: exactly how many ships were moved, exactly how steep and difficult the terrain genuinely was, and how much of the more theatrical imagery, like sails catching wind on dry land, reflects later embellishment rather than sober fact. But the essential achievement, moving a meaningful number of warships from one body of water to another entirely overland, in a matter of 1 or 2 nights, is corroborated across multiple accounts from different sides of the conflict, and stands as one of the genuinely remarkable engineering and logistical feats of the entire siege. The strategic consequences were significant, if perhaps less immediately decisive than the drama of the maneuver itself might suggest. With an Ottoman naval presence now established inside the Golden Horn, the defenders were forced to divert soldiers to guard the previously lower priority sea walls along the Horn, thinning the forces available to hold the vastly more critical Theodosian land walls, where the actual bombardment and eventual breakthrough would occur. It also delivered a significant blow to the defenders' morale at a critical early stage of the siege, demonstrating to besiegers and besieged alike that Mehmed was prepared to solve seemingly impossible tactical problems through sheer engineering audacity rather than accept the limits that had defeated every previous army to stand before these walls. Inside the city, news of the ships appearing in the Horn reportedly spread with real speed and real alarm, and the Defenders' War Council debated for several days over how, or whether, to respond. Some voices urged caution, worried that any attack on the repositioned fleet risked losing ships the defenders could not afford to lose for uncertain gain. Others argued that leaving an Ottoman naval presence inside the harbor unchallenged posed too great a long-term threat to ignore. The defenders attempted one bold response, a night attack using fire ships, intended to burn the newly repositioned Ottoman fleet at anchor inside the Horn. The attempt failed, reportedly betrayed in advance to the Ottomans. Accounts differ on exactly how, with some pointing to Genoese informants in Galata anxious to preserve their own colony's neutral status, Though this remains one of the more disputed and uncertain episodes of the siege, and the Byzantine and Allied ships involved suffered serious losses in the failed attack. From this point onward, the Ottoman navy maintained an uncontested presence inside the Golden Horn for the remainder of the siege, adding a second major front to a defense already stretched dangerously thin along its land walls. With the harbor compromised and the great cannon hammering steadily at the Theodosian walls day after day, the siege settled into the grinding, exhausting middle phase that would define most of its 53 days. A period of relentless bombardment, nightly repair, failed assaults, and slowly accumulating exhaustion on both sides of the wall. The siege of Constantinople formally began on the 2nd of April, 1453, when the first elements of Mehmed's army arrived outside the city's landward walls, and it would not end until the 29th of May, 53 days in total, a span of time that, for those living through it on both sides, must have felt considerably longer. A great deal of what is known about the day-to-day experience of the siege from the defenders' side comes from a small number of surviving eyewitness accounts, among the most valuable of which is a diary kept by a Venetian ship's surgeon named Niccolo Barbaro, present in the city throughout the siege, whose entries recorded weather, troop movements, casualty estimates, and the shifting mood inside the walls with a level of near-daily detail that few other surviving sources from either side can match. Accounts like his, alongside Byzantine chroniclers such as George Francis, who served Constantine personally and survived the siege himself, and various Ottoman court historians writing somewhat later, form the patchwork of overlapping, sometimes contradictory testimony from which the modern understanding of these 53 days has been carefully reconstructed. The Ottoman artillery train, which had been gathering and moving into position throughout the preceding weeks, opened its bombardment against the Theodosian walls within days of the army's arrival, concentrating its heaviest guns against several key sections, particularly around the Mesotichian, the middle stretch of wall where the terrain dipped slightly and the fortifications were, by some assessments, marginally less formidable than elsewhere along the circuit. Day after day, the guns fired what surviving accounts suggest was a relatively modest number of shots by later artillery standards, the great cannon itself perhaps managing only a handful of firings daily. Other guns in the train somewhat more, but sustained over weeks rather than hours. This bombardment did something no previous siege engine had managed against these walls. It steadily, visibly damaged them, cracking stone, toppling sections of parapet, and opening gaps that had never existed in the wall's 1100-year history. Each night, the defenders worked to undo what the day's bombardment had accomplished. Soldiers and civilians alike hauled timber, earth, rubble, and whatever other material could be gathered, building rough palisades and packed earth barriers behind and within the damaged stone sections, creating a kind of improvised secondary wall that, while far less imposing than the original stonework, absorbed cannon fire more effectively than shattered stone did. Packed earth, it turned out, could absorb the shock of a stone cannonball better than brittle, cracking masonry. This nightly cycle of daytime bombardment and nighttime repair became the defining rhythm of the siege's middle weeks, an exhausting routine that offered the defenders no real rest and steadily wore down both their physical strength and, gradually, their numbers. The Ottomans did not rely on bombardment alone. Throughout the siege, Mehmed's forces attempted several direct assaults against weakened sections of the wall, all of which were repulsed, at real cost to the attacking forces, by the defenders' desperate but effective resistance. Ottoman engineers, including a company of miners reportedly drawn from Serbian territory under Ottoman authority, also attempted a sustained mining campaign, digging tunnels beneath sections of the wall in an effort to either collapse fortifications from below or open a hidden passage into the city. Byzantine defenders, aided by a Scottish or possibly German engineer named Johannes Grant, whose precise origins are recorded inconsistently across different sources, successfully detected and countered most of these mining attempts, using techniques that included placing water-filled vessels along the walls to detect the vibrations of digging, then breaking into the tunnels themselves and destroying them with fire or flooding, or engaging the Ottoman miners directly underground in close combat. Mehmed also attempted, partway through the siege, to bring an enormous mobile siege tower and other siege engines against the walls at particularly vulnerable points. Efforts that met with mixed and generally limited success against defenders who fought with what multiple accounts, from both sides, describe as remarkable determination given their exhausted and heavily outnumbered condition. Negotiations continued intermittently even as the fighting ground on. Mehmed reportedly renewed offers to Constantine at various points during the siege, again offering terms that would have spared the city direct assault in exchange for surrender or tribute, and Constantine, according to the surviving accounts, continued to refuse, unwilling to hand over a city he considered his sacred trust rather than his personal possession to dispose of as he wished. In the middle weeks of May, a moment of brief, false hope passed through the city when lookouts spotted a ship approaching from the direction of the Aegean, and word spread rapidly that the long-awaited Venetian relief fleet had finally arrived. The ship, when it reached the harbor, turned out to be a single vessel, not a fleet, a Venetian ship that had gone out weeks earlier to search for the relief force everyone still hoped was coming, and had returned instead with grim news. No fleet had been found, no fleet appeared to be coming, at least not in time. Several accounts describe the ship's captain and crew choosing to return to the besieged city anyway, rather than sail to safety with the truth, a decision that, whatever its practical value, was remembered afterward as an act of genuine loyalty to a cause that, by that point in May, had little realistic hope left in it. By mid-May, the underlying arithmetic of the siege had become increasingly difficult to ignore for anyone paying close attention on either side. The defenders' numbers, already desperately thin at the siege's outset, had been steadily reduced by weeks of continuous combat, with no meaningful reinforcement arriving to replace losses. The wall sections around the Mesotikion, despite nightly repair efforts, had been damaged so extensively and so repeatedly that the makeshift earth and timber barrier standing in for the shattered stonework represented, in real terms, a far weaker obstacle than the original wall had ever been. Rumors and portents, some genuine astronomical or meteorological events and some likely embellished or invented after the fact, circulated through the city in its final days. Reports of strange lights over the Hagia Sophia, of icons that seemed to weep, of a sudden unexplained fog that some interpreted as a sign that the divine protection the city had relied on for 11 centuries was finally, catastrophically, withdrawing. Whatever their basis in genuine observed phenomena, these stories reflect something real about the psychological state of a population that had spent 7 weeks under relentless bombardment, watching walls they had been raised to believe were unbreakable crumble a little further with each passing day. Some accounts from this period, of varying reliability, suggest that certain advisors close to Constantine urged him, as the situation grew more desperate, to leave the city while safe passage might still be possible, preserve himself and the imperial line in exile, and continue the fight for Byzantine restoration from elsewhere. as earlier emperors had once done from Nicaea after 1204. Constantine, according to these same accounts, refused, apparently on the same grounds he had already given Mehmed's own envoys, that a city entrusted to him by God and his people was not his to abandon, whatever the odds against it. Whether this specific exchange happened exactly as later chroniclers described it is impossible to verify with full confidence, but it is consistent with everything else the surviving record suggests about the choice he had already made. On the 26th of May, Mehmed convened his war council to determine the shape of a final, decisive assault. Some of his senior advisors, according to Ottoman sources, continued to urge caution, worried about the cost of a direct attack against even weakened fortifications, and concerned about the possibility of Western relief forces eventually arriving. Mehmed, having invested enormous resources, both material and personal, into this siege, was unwilling to withdraw so close to what his engineers and commanders increasingly believed was an achievable breakthrough. The decision was made to launch a massive, coordinated final assault, targeting multiple sections of the wall simultaneously, timed for the pre-dawn hours of the 29th of May. In the days before the final assault, Mehmed reportedly gave his troops a day of rest, and according to several Ottoman sources, addressed his commanders and soldiers directly, promising the traditional rewards of a successfully stormed city to those who fought in the coming attack, while also reportedly issuing specific instructions intended to preserve the city's major buildings and its population from indiscriminate destruction, wishing to inherit a functioning capital rather than a ruin. How consistently those instructions were actually followed, once the fighting began and discipline inevitably frayed in the chaos of a breached city, is a separate question this account will return to. In Constantinople itself, the night before the assault was marked, according to multiple surviving accounts, by an extraordinary scene inside the Hagia Sophia, a final combined religious service, drawing together Orthodox and Catholic clergy, soldiers of multiple nationalities, and much of the remaining civilian population, in what several chroniclers describe as a moment of genuine unity inside a city that had spent months divided over questions of church union and doctrine. Constantine himself reportedly attended, along with his senior commanders, before returning to his post along the walls to oversee the defense through what would become the city's final night. The Ottoman assault began in the early hours before dawn on the 29th of May, launched in coordinated waves against multiple sections of the wall simultaneously, a tactic explicitly designed to exhaust the defenders' already dangerously thin numbers by forcing them to respond to threats at several points at once, with no meaningful reserves left to reinforce any single sector for long. The first waves, made up largely of irregular troops, were thrown against the walls essentially to absorb the defenders' strength and ammunition, followed by better organized regular Ottoman forces, and finally by the elite Janissary Corps, Mehmed's most disciplined and effective troops, held in reserve for the assault's decisive final push. The fighting at the Mesotikion, the same weakened central section that had absorbed the heaviest bombardment throughout the siege, proved decisive. Accounts describe a chaotic, close-quarters struggle along the damaged and hastily repaired fortifications there, with defenders under Justinian's direct command fighting with what multiple sources, again from both sides of the conflict, describe as desperate courage against overwhelming numerical pressure. At a critical point in the fighting, Justinian himself was severely wounded. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances, though most agree he was struck by a projectile, possibly while directing the defense of the wall, and was carried from the field for treatment, a decision that, whatever its medical necessity, appears to have had an immediate and serious effect on the morale and cohesion of the defenders around him, some of whom reportedly began to withdraw upon seeing their commander removed from the fighting. Ottoman tradition remembers this stage of the assault through the story of a janissary of enormous physical strength named Hassan of Ulubat, said to have been among the first to scale the outer wall near the Mezatikian and plant an Ottoman banner there, in full view of both sides, before being struck down in the fighting that followed. An episode celebrated in later Ottoman accounts as a moment of individual heroism that helped turn the tide of the assault's decisive early minutes, though. Like so many individual acts of battlefield heroism remembered generations after the fact, the precise details are difficult to separate from the legend that grew up around them. Separately, and at roughly the same time, Ottoman forces discovered or forced open a smaller postern gate along another section of the walls. Accounts differ on exactly how this occurred, with some suggesting it had been left carelessly unlocked in the chaos of the night's fighting, and others suggesting Ottoman soldiers forced or found their way through by other means, allowing a group of Ottoman troops to gain a foothold on the inner side of the fortifications, from which they were able to raise Ottoman banners visible to the wider defending force, an action that, combined with Justinian's withdrawal from the primary breach, appears to have triggered a broader collapse in the defenders' cohesion at multiple points along the wall in rapid succession. Once the walls were breached at several points nearly simultaneously, the organized defense of the city effectively ceased to exist as a coordinated force, dissolving into scattered, desperate resistance as Ottoman troops poured through the openings and into the city itself. What followed, in the hours after the walls fell, is again an area where this account will proceed carefully. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources, drawing on both Byzantine and Ottoman testimony, describe a period of significant violence and looting across parts of the city, consistent with the established conventions of siege warfare across this entire period, in which a city taken by storm rather than surrendered by negotiation was, under widely accepted military custom of the time, considered subject to a period of plunder as the price of continued resistance. This account will not attempt to catalog the details of that violence. What can be said is that it was serious, that it affected a meaningful portion of the city's population and property over the hours that followed the breach, and that Mehmed, according to multiple sources, moved relatively quickly, within the same day, to reassert order and bring the worst of the plundering to a halt, motivated at least in part by his stated intention to inherit Constantinople as a functioning, populated capital rather than an emptied ruin. Among the wider population, the hours following the breach brought a different, quieter kind of loss that later accounts dwell on almost as much as the physical violence itself. A portion of the city's remaining residents, along with soldiers cut off from any path of retreat, were taken captive in the confusion, a common and, by the standards of the period, broadly expected consequence of a city taken by storm rather than surrendered by treaty, and many of those captives passed, in the weeks and months that followed, into slavery or into ransom negotiations conducted by surviving relatives and merchant contacts abroad. A grim but unremarkable feature of medieval siege warfare on every side of every major conflict of the era, Christian and Muslim alike, rather than a practice unique to this particular conquest. By the close of the 29th of May, 1453, the city that had stood unconquered by direct assault for over 1,000 years had fallen. And somewhere amid the chaos of that final morning's fighting, and circumstances that remain, even now, genuinely uncertain, the last Roman emperor had disappeared. What actually happened to Constantine XI in the final hours of the siege is one of the more historically contested details of the entire story, and it deserves to be treated with real care, because the gap between the popular legend and the documented historical record is wider here than almost anywhere else in this account. The most widely repeated version of events, developed across various retellings in the decades and centuries following the siege, holds that Constantine, upon realizing the walls had been breached and the battle was lost, tore off his imperial regalia so as not to be identifiable as the emperor, and threw himself into the fighting at the breach alongside his remaining soldiers, choosing to die anonymously as a common defender of his city rather than survive its fall or risk capture. It is a genuinely moving image, and it has understandably shaped how this moment is remembered and depicted for centuries afterward. The honest historical answer is that no surviving eyewitness account offers a fully confirmed, independently corroborated version of Constantine's final moments. Several near-contemporary sources describe him fighting near the breach at the Mesotikion in the assault's final stages, which aligns with where the fiercest fighting is known to have occurred and where his presence, given his role directing the defense throughout the siege, would be entirely plausible. Other accounts, somewhat later and more embellished, add the specific detail of the discarded imperial regalia, and still others offer versions that differ in smaller details of timing and location. No body confirmed with certainty to be Constantine's was ever recovered and positively identified, despite reported efforts by Ottoman soldiers to search among the dead for the fallen emperor, reportedly at Mehmed's own request, since confirming the death of the Roman emperor mattered considerably to the Ottoman sultan's own claim over what he had just conquered. This uncertainty is not a modern historical failing so much as a natural consequence of the chaos of the moment itself, a city being breached at multiple points nearly simultaneously, an emperor fighting, by most accounts, in the thick of that chaos rather than observing it from a safe distance, and a period of significant disorder in the hours that followed, during which careful documentation of any individual's fate was, understandably, not the priority of anyone involved. What can be said with reasonable historical confidence is this: Constantine did not flee the city, did not survive the siege, and died during or shortly after the fall of the walls he had spent 53 days defending. Beyond that, the precise details, the discarded regalia, the exact location, the specific manner of his death, rest on a layer of near-contemporary legend that may capture something true about how he chose to face the city's fall, or may reflect, at least in part, the natural human impulse to give a fittingly noble ending to a story that badly wanted one. This uncertainty proved, in later centuries, to be fertile ground for reinterpretation. During the Greek struggle for independence from Ottoman rule in the 19th century, Constantine's memory was revived with particular intensity. His ambiguous death reimagined as a kind of suspended promise, a last emperor not conclusively dead, a nation not conclusively finished, a story whose ending had simply not yet been written. Streets, ships, and later, in the 20th century, entire generations of Greek children were named for him, and his image, whatever its distance from verified historical fact, became one of the most enduring symbols of continuity between the Byzantine past and the modern Greek present. Constantine XI became, in the centuries that followed, an almost mythic figure in Greek folk memory, sometimes called the Marble Emperor, from a later legend holding that he had not truly died at all, but had been turned to stone by an angel and hidden away beneath the city, to awaken someday and reclaim it. It is exactly the kind of legend that grows around a genuinely uncertain ending. When the historical record cannot say precisely how a story concluded, popular memory tends to supply an ending of its own. One that says less about the actual facts and more about what the people telling the story needed that ending to mean. Later generations of historians, working with steadily more critical methods and a wider range of surviving sources, have generally treated the most vivid elements of the death of Constantine narrative as probable literary elaboration built around a real, verified core, an emperor who died fighting in the breach on the last day of his empire. That the precise embellishments cannot be verified does not make the underlying courage they described any less historically grounded. It simply means the story, like so many accounts of chaotic final moments throughout history, was shaped in the retelling by people who needed it to mean something, even as the bare facts beneath it remained real enough on their own. What is certain, beyond any legend, is the plain historical fact underlying all of it. With Constantine's death, whatever its exact circumstances, the line of Roman emperors that stretched back, in an unbroken thread, to Augustus himself, came to its final end. The empire that had called itself Roman for nearly 1,500 years, that had outlasted the fall of Rome in the West by nearly 1,000 years, that had survived Arab sieges, Bulgar invasions, and even the catastrophic wound of 1204, ended, in practical terms, on a single morning in May, inside the walls of the city its first founder had built to be eternal. Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople in person on the same day the walls fell, riding, according to multiple accounts, directly to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had stood at the symbolic heart of the Byzantine Empire for 9 centuries, since Justinian had rebuilt it in the 6th century. What he found there, and what he did next, would set the tone for how the conquered city was to be governed going forward. According to the accounts that survive, Mehmed ordered the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque almost immediately, a decision consistent with established Islamic legal custom regarding cities taken by force rather than surrendered by treaty, under which the principal church of a conquered city could be repurposed for the conqueror's faith. The great mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and Byzantine emperors that had adorned the cathedral's interior for centuries were not, in this initial period, destroyed outright, but were gradually covered over in the years and generations that followed, plastered and later painted over rather than physically removed, a detail that would matter enormously centuries later, when restoration work in the 20th century revealed that many of these ancient images had survived beneath their covering, largely intact. Beyond the Hagia Sophia, Mehmed moved relatively quickly to re-establish order and begin rebuilding the city's administrative and economic life, aware that a depopulated, plundered ruin would serve his ambitions far less than a functioning capital. He took the formal title of Caesar of Rome alongside his existing Ottoman titles, a claim that reflected his own understanding, and the understanding of many of his contemporaries, that in conquering Constantinople he had not simply defeated a rival state, but had inherited, in some meaningful sense, the legitimacy and legacy of the Roman imperial line itself, a claim that Western European rulers, predictably, did not accept, but one that shaped Ottoman self-conception as an imperial power for generations afterward. In Ottoman and later usage, he became known by the honorific Fatih, the Conqueror, a title that has remained attached to his name ever since. Mehmed actively worked to repopulate the city in the years following the conquest, which some surviving population estimates suggest had been reduced to as few as 30 or 40,000 people by the time of the siege, down drastically from its earlier medieval peak. He encouraged and in some cases compelled resettlement, bringing in Muslim, Christian, and Jewish populations from other parts of his growing empire, offering incentives to merchants and craftsmen willing to relocate, and establishing new administrative and religious institutions throughout the city. Within a few decades, Constantinople, increasingly referred to in various forms of the name that would eventually become Istanbul, itself likely derived from a Greek phrase meaning roughly to the city, which local Greek speakers had informally used to refer to Constantinople for centuries even before the conquest, had been substantially rebuilt and repopulated, transformed from the depleted, half-empty capital of a dying empire into the flourishing new capital of a rapidly expanding one. Across the Golden Horn, the Genoese colony of Galata, which had spent the siege attempting to preserve a fragile neutrality between the two sides, found its own status settled quickly and firmly under the new order. Mehmed extended terms allowing the colony's Genoese residents to remain and continue their trading activities, but stripped away the fortifications and much of the practical autonomy Galata had enjoyed under Byzantine-era arrangements, absorbing it, over the following years, ever more fully into the administrative and military structure of the new Ottoman capital across the water. The dual city arrangement that had defined the Constantinople area for centuries, an imperial capital on one shore, a semi-independent merchant colony on the other, gradually gave way to a single, unified metropolis under Ottoman rule. The city's Christian population did not disappear, though its status changed considerably. Mehmed established a formal Orthodox Patriarchate under Ottoman authority shortly after the conquest, appointing a new patriarch and granting the Christian community a recognized, if subordinate, legal status within the Ottoman administrative system, a structure that would continue, with various modifications, for centuries afterward. This was not equality in any modern sense. Christian and Jewish communities within the Ottoman Empire operated under a distinct and generally disadvantaged legal framework compared to Muslim subjects. But it was also not the wholesale destruction or expulsion that some contemporary Western accounts, written to horrify their own audiences, sometimes suggested had occurred. The administrative structure Mehmed built to govern his newly diverse capital came to be known, in later centuries, as the millet system, a framework under which religious communities, Muslim, Orthodox Christian, Armenian Christian, and Jewish among them, were granted a significant degree of internal self-governance over matters of personal law, religious practice, and communal administration, even while remaining politically and fiscally subordinate to the Ottoman state as a whole. It was a pragmatic solution to governing a genuinely diverse population without demanding uniform religious conversion, and it shaped the character of the city and of the wider Ottoman Empire for the following centuries, allowing Constantinople to remain, beneath its new imperial administration, one of the most religiously and ethnically layered cities anywhere in the world. A great covered market, growing over the following decades into what became known as the Grand Bazaar, developed near the city's old commercial heart, drawing merchants from across the expanding Ottoman world and beyond it, a direct commercial descendant of the trading crossroads the city had always been, under whichever empire happened to rule it. Physically, the city itself continued to transform over the following decades and centuries as successive Ottoman sultans added mosques, palaces, covered markets, and public infrastructure across a skyline that had, for over 1,000 years, been shaped primarily by Byzantine church domes and now increasingly became shaped by both those older domes and the new minarets rising alongside and, in some cases, directly above them. Topkapi Palace, begun under Mehmed himself in the years following the conquest, became the seat of Ottoman imperial power for the next 4 centuries, a role Constantinople's great palace had once played for the Byzantine emperors who preceded him. The city that had been built as New Rome had become, without ever losing its layered, cosmopolitan character, an Ottoman capital, and would remain the seat of Ottoman power until the empire's own eventual end, nearly 5 centuries later. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Western Europe that arrived, in most places, not as sudden panic but as a slow, dawning realization of what had actually happened. News of the siege and its outcome spread through diplomatic and merchant channels over the weeks and months that followed, and the reaction, and surviving letters, sermons, and chronicles from across Catholic Europe, ranged from genuine grief to alarm at what an expanding Ottoman power on Europe's southeastern frontier might mean for the kingdoms and city-states that lay closest to it. Pope Nicholas V called, unsuccessfully in any large-scale sense, for a new crusade to retake the city, a call that several of his successors would repeat, with similarly limited practical results, over the following decades. The military and political reality by this point was that no single Western power, and no coalition that proved willing to actually mobilize together, had the resources or the unified will to seriously challenge Ottoman control of Constantinople, and the city would remain under Ottoman rule for the better part of the next 5 centuries. Alongside the political and religious shock, though, something else was already underway, something that would prove, in the long run, to reshape European intellectual life in ways that had little to do with military reconquest. For roughly a century before the siege, and accelerating considerably in the years immediately surrounding it, Byzantine scholars, carrying with them Greek manuscripts, classical texts, and a living tradition of Greek scholarship that had, in important respects, never entirely been lost in the East the way much of it had faded from direct access in the Latin West, had been traveling to Italy, teaching, translating, and in some cases settling permanently in Italian cities eager for exactly the kind of classical learning these scholars carried with them. It is worth being careful about how this part of the story gets told, because it is one of the more frequently overstated claims in popular retellings of 1453. The fall of Constantinople did not single-handedly cause the Renaissance, which was already well underway in Italy by the early 15th century, driven by its own complex mixture of economic, political, and intellectual currents that had little directly to do with events in the Eastern Mediterranean. Many of the most significant transfers of Greek manuscripts and scholars to Italy had already occurred in the decades before 1453, not after it, driven by earlier crises and by a genuine, independent Italian humanist appetite for classical Greek learning that predated the siege by generations. What the fall of Constantinople did do, more accurately, was accelerate and finalize a process already well underway, while also adding real symbolic and emotional weight to it, a final, dramatic closing of the door on the ancient Greek-speaking world's last independent political existence, which gave the scholars, manuscripts, and traditions that had already been migrating westward an added sense of urgency and historical significance. Scholars who might otherwise have divided their careers between Constantinople and Italy now had, in many cases, no Eastern capital left to return to. Their teaching of Greek language and classical texts to a generation of Italian humanists helped feed directly into the flourishing of Renaissance classical scholarship that was already blossoming around them, contributing meaningfully, if not singularly or exclusively, to a broader intellectual movement that would go on to reshape European art, philosophy, and science over the following centuries. Among the scholars who made this journey westward, a handful of names stand out in the historical record for the scale of their lasting influence. A churchman and scholar named Basilios Bessarion, who had left Constantinople for Italy years before the siege and eventually rose to become a cardinal of the Roman Church, spent decades gathering and preserving Greek manuscripts, eventually donating his enormous personal library to Venice, where it became a founding collection of what would grow into one of Europe's great libraries. Other émigré scholars took up teaching posts at Italian universities, training a generation of Western humanists in a language that few in the Latin West had studied seriously for centuries, work that fed directly into a wider revival of interest in ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature. There is a curious timing to note here as well. Within only a few years of Constantinople's fall, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg had already begun printing books using movable metal type, an innovation that would soon allow the very manuscripts these émigré scholars carried westward to be copied and distributed at a scale no scribe working by hand could ever have matched, amplifying their influence on European learning far beyond what the scholars who carried them out of a falling empire could likely have imagined. There was also a harder, more practical consequence of the conquest, felt less in libraries than in harbors and counting houses. With Constantinople and the straits beyond it now under firm Ottoman control, European merchants trading with Asia found the overland and eastern Mediterranean routes that had long carried silk, spices, and other valuable goods westward increasingly subject to Ottoman tolls, restrictions, and simple uncertainty. This commercial pressure, among several other contributing factors, helped push the maritime kingdoms of the Atlantic coast, Portugal foremost among them, toward a search for entirely new sea routes to Asia that bypassed the eastern Mediterranean altogether, a search that would culminate, within just a few decades of the city's fall, in voyages around the southern tip of Africa and, not long after, across the Atlantic Ocean entirely, setting in motion a reorientation of global trade whose consequences would eventually reach far beyond anything the merchants and sultans of 1453 could have foreseen. There is also a longer, more somber accounting to make here, separate from the question of manuscripts and scholars. An empire that had, in one continuous political line, stretched back to Augustus himself, that had preserved and transmitted Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology across 15 centuries of continuous institutional life, came to its final end in 1453. Whatever was carried westward in the decades before and after the siege represented only a fraction of what that continuous tradition had actually contained across its long life, countless texts, institutions, and forms of accumulated knowledge that simply ended with the empire that had sustained them in ways no surviving manuscript can fully recover or represent. The story of 1453, then, resists the kind of simple accounting that popular retellings sometimes reach for, neither a pure catastrophe with nothing gained, nor a hidden blessing in disguise that made the coming Renaissance possible. It was both a genuine, irrecoverable ending and, entangled within that ending, the acceleration of something that was already growing elsewhere, carried forward by people who had no choice but to leave behind the only political home that tradition had ever known. There is a particular kind of lesson buried inside a story like this one, and it is easy to miss if you only remember the dramatic parts, the great cannon, the ships hauled over a hillside in the dark, the walls finally giving way after 1100 years of holding. The lesson is not really about any single one of those moments. It is about the shape of the whole story, stretched out across more than a millennium, from a Roman emperor building a new capital at the edge of two continents, to that same empire's final emperor disappearing into the chaos of his own city's final morning. Empires, it turns out, rarely die in the moment their fall is finally recorded. Constantinople's fall was written, in a very real sense, in 1204, when a crusading army broke a wall of belief that no army had managed to break before, even though the actual stones of the Theodosian walls held for another 250 years after that. It was written in the slow bleeding of Anatolia after Manzikert, in treasuries that grew thinner with each passing reign, and alliances offered too late and accepted too reluctantly, and in a world beyond the walls that had, for reasons both understandable and regrettable, largely stopped watching closely enough to help in time. And yet none of that slow decline makes the final 53 days any less remarkable. A city with perhaps a tenth of its former population, defended by a fraction of the soldiers its walls were designed to hold, resisted the full weight of a rapidly expanding empire for nearly 2 months, inflicting real losses, forcing genuine hesitation among men's own commanders, and falling, in the end, not through any single failure of courage, but through an accumulation of structural disadvantages that no courage alone could have overcome. Constantine XI's refusal to surrender did not save his city. It did not need to save the city to matter. It meant that when the new Rome finally did fall, it fell fighting, rather than quietly handing over the keys to a story that had already, by then, been unfolding toward this ending for 2.5 centuries. Think back, for a moment, across everything this story has actually held. A city founded to outlast its founder's own name, and very nearly succeeding. Walls so carefully engineered that they turned back 1,000 years of armies before a single new invention finally caught up to them. A wound in 1204 that never quite closed, inflicted not by a distant enemy but by people who called themselves friends. A young sultan whose singular obsession, however it is ultimately judged, achieved something that generations of far more experienced rulers before him had each, in turn, failed to achieve. And a last emperor who, whatever the precise and now unrecoverable details of his final hour, made the one choice that history remembers most clearly of all: he did not leave. What lingers longest, perhaps, in a story like this, is the sheer scale of continuity that came to an end on that particular morning. 15 centuries is a difficult span to hold in the mind all at once, long enough that the empire's founding and its final fall are separated by roughly the same distance in time that separates you, in this moment, from the era of that founding itself. An institution that outlasts 15 generations of everything else around it starts to feel, to the people living inside it, less like a political arrangement and more like a fact of nature, as permanent and unquestionable as the walls that were supposed to protect it forever. But nothing, in the end, is protected forever. Not by walls 12 meters thick, not by 11 centuries of survived sieges. Not by a divine reputation built up over so many generations that an entire city genuinely believed its own protection was guaranteed. The Theodosian walls did their job for as long as the tools arrayed against them remained the tools they had been built to withstand. When those tools changed, when gunpowder finally caught up to stone, even the most perfectly engineered defense in the medieval world eventually met its match. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson this story leaves behind, if it leaves behind any lesson at all. Not that empires fall because they grow weak, exactly, though this one certainly did. Not that walls fail because they were poorly built, because these were, by any honest measure, some of the finest fortifications the ancient and medieval world ever produced. It is simply this, that everything built by human hands, however vast, however carefully engineered, however many centuries it manages to stand, exists inside time rather than outside it. The New Rome stood for 1100 years believing itself eternal, and for most of those years, it very nearly was. Its story does not end with a lesson about failure. It ends, if it ends with anything at all, with a reminder of just how long a single act of belief, well defended, can hold back the ordinary passage of centuries, and how remarkable it is, not that it eventually gave way, but that it took so terribly long to do so.